Scrub a seat. Hi everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm Shayna. I'm the director of TASC. We are very happy to be producing this report. It's the second one with CIOB. We've worked together on a very critical issue facing Ireland, and I'm glad that we've been able to do this. I'm also grateful that Rob has, I have to say that it's Rob, but I just want to thank Rob for doing it because it's his last report for us, or at least in a public way. And I want to say how much we've appreciated his time at TASC. So I was grateful to be able to say hello to you and welcome you, and also thank Rob for his hard work for the organization. It's very much appreciated. And to thank Joseph for approaching us with his work again. Thank you. So, welcome. Please feel free to ask questions after the presentation. And again, thanks. I will turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, is this? Yeah, it is on. Yeah, thanks, Shayna, and yeah, thank you all for being here today. As Shayna says, this is the second report we've done with TASC and with Rob. In 2021, we did a report looking at job quality in the Irish construction sector, which was kind of a state of the nation, really, for the construction sector in Ireland. So we're delighted to be focusing on something more specific this time around in the form of MMC. I suppose just in terms of format, I'm just going to say a few words from a CIOB perspective, and then hand to Rob as the lead author, who will give us an overview of the report. We're then going to hear from Nessa Horrigan, TD with the Green Party, who's going to give us a political, but also, as I'm hearing more and more, somewhat of a technical expert perspective. We're also going to hear from Manus O'Donnell from the Department of Enterprise, and also Dan from UCD, who's representing Construct Innovate today, and thanks to Dan for stepping in at the last minute. So yeah, the CIOB works to a public interest remit. So I suppose when you look at something like modern methods of construction and the potential benefits it can have in terms of faster delivery of buildings, and thinking about housing in particular, higher quality and more sustainable, and arguably, and this is something we'll get into, more cost effective when it's done right, it's pretty clear that this is something that we should be trying to do, particularly given the context of the housing supply crisis and affordability crisis that we have in Ireland at the moment. So I think it's really clear that the goal is worth striving for, and I think Rob has done a really good job in this report of outlining, why are we not doing more of this? What are the barriers to it? We have some uptake in Ireland, but it's probably not mainstream as it is in other countries. So I think the report does a really good job of identifying the barriers, those that we can change, and then at the end we've kind of partnered up and coming up with some policy recommendations, and indeed recommendations for the industry that we feel could be put in place to make MMC a more mainstream option, and indeed a source of one of the solutions to the housing supply shortfall. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rob, who will give us an outline of the report. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Joe. So I hope everyone can hear me okay. So modern methods of construction. I tried to make the report as accessible as possible for non-construction people, including people like me. I'm not an engineer or an architect or anything like that, so I'll pitch my presentation accordingly, and that may be too low or for some people, but it might just be right for others. So what is MMC? This is the outline of my presentation. What are the benefits? What are the barriers? And what can be done to scale up greater use of modern methods of construction? So MMC is a broad term, and it's almost like a spectrum of different types of construction processes and components that are used. What we define, and what I define it in the report to be, is construction which is done off-site in a factory setting. And you can see there's a variety of ways that is done. If you look at the top left picture there, that's what's full modular construction, where you have complete 3D units that are manufactured in a factory and then are transported onto the building site. Moving down to the bottom left, these then can be used to make a building by stacking one on top of the other. But full modular 3D volumetric, that's not the only type by any means. What you also have is more 2D flat or panelized construction, as you see in the top right, whereby a part of the building, such as the wall or the roof, is manufactured in a factory and then brought on site and combined with traditional types of construction processes. Now, it's called modern methods of construction, but that's a little bit of a misnomer, because some of these methods have been around for quite some time. If you look at the bottom right there, that's precast concrete, where basically the concrete is cast in a factory and then transported onto the site to complete with other materials and components. But concrete is something we're less interested in, and something we want to move away from, because of the high levels of embodied carbon in the production of concrete. And so what that speaks to some of the potential benefits of MMC. Depending on the types of materials that are used, it can be much more sustainable from an embodied carbon perspective. That's one of the benefits. Another benefit is that it can provide for higher quality potentially as well, because you have components, or in some cases the majority of the structure manufactured in a factory. You're not dependent on the workmanship of the trade person involved. So it potentially allows for higher quality. Potentially also is quicker as well, and if it's quicker, you can build more units per year, and so it can contribute towards alleviating some of our housing shortages. And being in a factory, as you see in the top left, it can provide for more pleasant working conditions. We actually have a pretty good safety record in Irish building sites, but construction is a hazardous occupation. So there's lots of other different types. You see in the bottom left there, that's what's called a timber framed building. Now that doesn't mean that you have completely timber buildings. If you look at the top right, that's actually a timber framed house there. So you have the timber frame, which is combined with traditional block work for the outer part. And then lots of other combinations. You have bottom right there is what's called a light gauge steel structure. That's popular in things like apartments and nursing homes and things like that. So lots of different types, and there's different benefits. But the nuts and bolts of the report is really what are the barriers to MMC in Ireland, and what are some of the things that can be done to address it. So I identified 6 different, I guess, issues facing the sector. I won't go through them all in detail, but so there's market structural factors, finance and insurance, regulatory issues, procurement, planning, and I also talk about social housing. So I'll take a selection of those today. Market structural factors being very important. So one of the reasons why MMC is not used as much as we'd like it to be used is that it is often more expensive to use it. So therefore, contractors are less inclined to use it, because it's basically more expensive. Particular the full volumetric modular, less so with timber frame buildings. That's quite well established. And there's a number of factors which elevate the costs. So for instance, there's a lack of demand certainty, and I'll talk a bit more about that throughout the presentation. But if you're a manufacturer and there is uncertainty of demand, you're not going to kit out your factory with the plant and machinery that you need in order to build efficiently. There's a lack of standardization. There's many different house types, both public and private housing, and I'll talk about that. There's attitudes as well, both in terms of the final consumer, the household, They have the vision of prefabs in their mind and all of the quality issues that accompany those. And then also there's attitudes from developers. They mightn't be educated, and they might also have some of those prejudices about prefabs as well. So for the research, what we did was we first had a roundtable discussion where we invited a variety of stakeholders from the private sector and from the public sector and the third sector. And then we did, then I did a series of interviews. I think I interviewed 30 people in all, mostly private sector, but also from the non-market sector as well. And so here's one of a quote from a modular manufacturer talking about demand certainty and the importance of a clear pipeline. Without having a clear pipeline of work in front of us, it's difficult to convince the owners of the company to put money to the business that can be sporadic. So like at the minute, we're all in on residential. This time last year, we were all in on farmer. This time next year, it's looking like we're back to bathroom pods and not doing any residential. So we have to stay agile as a business in order to be able to shift from a farmer project to a residential back to bathroom pods. So we can't set up rails or production line in a factory stuck to a particular module size. Because if we do this 6 months time our order book changes, we might have to reconfigure the factory. So they can't tailor the factory according to the type of unit that they're producing. There isn't this certainty of demand so that they can kit out things appropriately. Also standardization is a really important issue as well. And this is a quote from a timber frame manufacturer. So take a general good design we've done through with Glenveigh. You're looking at a square footage of about 26 to 27 euros per square foot. If I was to put a one-off into the factory, 35, 36 euros a square foot, even 36 euros, it wasn't enough. So if you're having a product which is, you're doing repeatedly, the costs are much lower compared to if it's a bespoke or a one-off product. And so the extent of one-off housing in Ireland is an issue. It makes a lot of off-site construction essentially unviable. If you look at, say, timber frame housing, various estimates, but it's between 25 to 50% of houses built in Ireland, depending on what estimate. But if you look at one-offs, one of the interviewees told me it's only 3% because it's just not economically viable. Now, there's a series of regulatory issues as well with MMC. So we have height restrictions on combustible materials. So that essentially means, and I'm not saying good or bad regulatory issues, they're there, so I'm just highlighting them. It means essentially that you can't use timber when you go above 10 meters, which effectively limits timber frame houses to 4 to 5 stories. So that's a major impediment, and particularly in the context of more and more apartments being built, that limits the amount of timber that's going to be used in apartments because of these restrictions on combustible materials. Now, many of the engineers I spoke to insisted that timber in modern use can be made as fire resistant as steel when you treat it with certain chemicals such as gypsum and other types, and when it's chunkier as well. Building regulations contains guidance on allowable materials. MMC materials are untested. So basically, if you look at our building regulations, they will have guidance for contractors, for developers, on what type of products that are compliant with the building code, from a fire safety issue, from various other issues, thermal performance. But particularly with modular manufacturing, modular units, a lot of these materials and processes are new, and therefore they're untested. And therefore, contractors and others are just very reluctant to use these materials that are untested, and they don't want to sign off on them because if something goes wrong, they might get sued or something like that. And there are testing facilities in Ireland, but these testing facilities are actually clogged up. It takes a lot of time and it's expensive to to do these tests. Here is a quote from an engineer. If you're building using traditional methods of construction, there's codes that tell you what to do. So it's very easy for you as a company to follow those codes. And no, you're not going to get sued, essentially, if you get it wrong. But with panelized and volumetric modular, these codes don't exist. Then I talk about social housing quite a bit in the report. And one thing that comes out is the importance of direct build of social housing. So there's a number of different ways of constructing social housing. Direct build is where local authorities, typically, they build on public land, as opposed to, say, other types of social housing construction, such as turnkey or Part 5, where it's outsourced to the private sector to a large extent. Even though most people, or many people, believe, and I think there's good evidence, but some people disagree, that direct build is slower and more expensive. The advantage of direct build is that the local authority or whatever public entity, it has control over the type of unit that is built. It has control over the design process. So it can dictate whether NMC is used. So in this way, using direct build, the state can drive the sector forward by creating this certainty of demand. With other types of social housing construction, the design process is vested in the private sector. So even if it's quicker or cheaper, it's up to them whether they use basically NMC. Another big issue is the lack of standardization in social housing designs. So there was a document released, I think it was the Department of Housing, I can't remember, it was just over a year ago, and it had design guidelines for local authorities. But there was actually almost 60 different types of units suggested for local authorities, different types of units that they could use in building social housing. Now, a variety is needed. You know, there's different needs. There's 2, 3 bedroom, 1 bedrooms, people with disability, accessibility issues. But certainly this impedes standardization and elevates costs. And not only is there almost 60 different types of units in the design guidelines, the local authorities, the AHBs and the LDA, they might also have their own types of design. So they're free to actually ignore the design guidelines, especially the bigger local authorities who might have the expertise to do so, and the LDA. So this impedes standardization and elevates costs. Here's some quotes again from this from a modular manufacturer. There was a meeting with the Department of Housing where they said, right, they launched these designs, standardized designs, here you go, these can be rolled out to all of the various local authorities. The local authority can take these designs and implement them, or they can tweak them or change them to suit themselves. So they can go about their own design. Another modular manufacturer, again, the importance of demand and standardization comes out here. Once we got awarded the Ukrainian project during the design phase, we finished the factory, we filled it full of equipment. Our manpower here at the factory has gone from 25 up to 110. Okay, we have 2 factories running, producing between 6 and 8 houses per week. So that's what a pipeline can do. So the first houses we built, the 2-bedroom ones, these ones took 60 days. Okay, we got that down to 40 days, and now we're down to 20 days. So the importance of learning by doing in reducing costs, and the importance of both demand and standardization comes out here. Okay, quickly then, there was other issues that I talk about. Procurement. Basically, our procurement system isn't set up to facilitate NMC. So if, say, a developer gets planning permission and does a detailed design and then hands that over to a contractor and says, could you build using modular or NMC or something like that? it mightn't be possible for the actual builder to build according to MMC or modular or panelized, because it might have been designed in such a way that it's just not possible to do that with volumetric or MMC. So you need early contractor involvement. You need the contractor having some say in the design process. Planning, there was kind of diversity of views on planning. Some people said that the planning system wasn't a big issue because basically construction happens after you get planning permission. You don't begin construction until after you get planning permission, so therefore it doesn't sort of change the calculation as to whether you use MMC or not. While people, at least in the private sector, they all agreed that the planning system was a problem for construction, they didn't necessarily believe it impeded MMC, but others felt it did, because basically, even though the system that we have in place is such that you begin construction after you get planning permission. If there was more certainty in the planning application and the planning decision, if you knew with a high level of certainty that you were going to be granted planning permission, well then you could sort of overlap construction with other parts of the development process, and therefore you could yield some of the financial benefits of speed. So there was a bit of disagreement there. Less disagreement was that sometimes there was problems with unserviced sites, and that impeded MMC, because if you're waiting for Irish Water or whoever, the ESB, to connect the services to the site, you don't want a module hanging around on the site and potentially getting damaged. So that discouraged use of MMC. And then I already talked about the extent of one-off housing in Ireland. That certainly elevates costs, and it makes little sense to use MMC in that sense. Finance and insurance. Some insurers were reluctant to underwrite MMC because a lot of these products are untried and untested, and what insurers typically do is they look at past data to calculate the risk of insuring something, whether that's the professional indemnity insurance of the architects or essentially the house insurance for the completed product. There's just a reluctance for insurance to underwrite. And similarly, for financiers, whether it's banks or investment funds, there's also a reluctance there to finance MMC projects, both in terms of the development process and getting a mortgage. So it's actually very difficult to get a mortgage if you've got a modular home, because the banks will say, well, anyone can pick up this modular home and drive away with it, or something like that. So there's just issues there, but if the building regulations were updated to include the components and processes that are used in MMC, that would allay some of the concerns of the funders and insurers. So some of the policies that I recommend: review the height restrictions on timber with international comparative evidence. Now, I'm not a fire engineer or anything like that. I understand this is ongoing. So just review it to see if they are fire safe. Now, most of the engineers I spoke to said that they are, but if you look at some of the countries that use timber extensively, they do have inferior fire records, but I don't know if they use modern timber, which is treated for fire safety issues. Broaden the building codes or the technical guidance documents to include materials used in off-site construction. Increase rapid delivery of social housing through direct build, because in that way the state can drive it forward, whereas they can't with other types of building. Procure and plan to use MMC, maybe limit the amount of one-off housing that we have, and I'm sure lots of the TDs would be delighted to take that up. So, thank you.
Thanks, Rob. So much to get our teeth into there. The report is really quite extensive, and yeah, I think you pitched it right between technical and layperson, so thanks for that. So we're going to hear a response, excuse me, we're going to hear a response from panelists now. So I'll move to Nessa first, who'll give us a political response. Then we'll hear from Daniel, who'll give an academic response. and then Manus, who can speak on behalf of the civil service. So, Nessa, would you like to give us a response?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm told I'm meant to keep it to 5 minutes, so I will try. There's so much in this document though, and I see my colleague Deputy Stephen Matthews here, who's chair of the Housing Committee, and I know that they have touched on some of these issues, but there's so much in this report to consider that I'm sure this report will find its way to the committee, and I see Deputy King Calhoun there as well, who you're on that committee, aren't you? Yeah. So a lot for the political establishment to do, because a lot of this is around, and what so many construction projects fall foul of are the boring things like procurement and finance. But I suppose from my view, you know, in some ways this report, like, this is not new. The idea of prefabricated elements in buildings is not new. Like, you know, we're all talking about RTE the last few months. The original buildings of RTE are effectively cassettes that are constructed, clicked together on site. And certainly, you know, in 2005 I was working on a project out in Marion Road where all the bathrooms were pods that came in, you know, it came down the Liffey effectively. And were fully sealed and fully fitted out interior-wise. So if you indulge me to just kind of go through what the huge impacts would be from a green perspective, is that we now live in an era where particularly domestic houses are moving towards almost being like machines. You know, it's much more about airtightness, it's much more about the systems that are contained within the building. And if you can focus on manufacturing processes that are factory standardized, so basically you have somebody in a factory who can test it, can get really good at making it and sign a piece of paper before it leaves the factory that this item is perfect. That's a win, because when you're on site you are then testing for things like airtightness, you are doing things like commissioning, you are testing the standards, and it needs to be right. So we can't live anymore in an era where you think you're building something to a B2 or a B1 or an A2 standard, and then post-occupancy, 18 months later, you go back and you realise, actually this is below B standard in terms of the way it's operating effectively in terms of the environment. So, you know, there's huge possibility there in bringing it up to that factory standard. Also, I have to say, you know, I'm very happy to see the kind of focus on timber. Because from our point of view, it's that renewable resource that really the Irish construction industry has kind of resisted in a way that maybe other countries in the EU have not. It's a growing industry both in terms of producing the raw material in this country, and then we could be manufacturing more and doing more to put it into buildings. And I do actually think that we should be looking at it in terms of the fire regs. We do have very, very high standards of fire regs, quite rightly, in this country. But, you know, any industry has new products coming online, and those products have to be then brought in to the system, and the system has to upgrade and change its regulations to recognise that. I've mentioned the issue of post-occupancy, and I do think prefabricated items fare very well. Where the construction industry is educated and trained in terms of putting those items on site in a way that doesn't damage them and allows them to operate correctly, post-occupancy, they do tend to operate very well and perform very well. And then obviously there's that commissioning part, which is making sure that the systems, more and more, you know, those proprietary systems, the services of a building are operating right to the tip top of where they could be. And I think that's really, really important. And maybe one thing that we could talk about, maybe it's more research to be done, but is the possibility, you know, when you're talking about prefabricated items and NMC, around demountable buildings and the full cradle-to-cradle lifespan of a building. So when you have those factory items that, you know, it is more of a modular sensibility, you know, the possibilities for reuse and cradle-to-cradle lifespan, there's huge possibilities there in terms of the carbon impact of materials in the long run, because they can be reused again and again, pulled apart, put back together, but at a standard which means they're truly, truly reusable. I mean, you know, that again, not something that's new in construction. Most architects and builders will tell you that technically the lifespan of a brick is 1,000 years, right? But it depends on the mortar, because you need mortar that you can pull apart. The mortar should be less strong than the brick, right? That's basically what you're talking about with demountable buildings, and actually the only way to do it are on building systems like this. So then from a purely political point of view, the two things that I'm going to be taking away from this report, and I think the two things that I'm going to be, as you say, doing a bit of work on and start nagging people about, not that we haven't been doing that already, is scale and standardization. So, as I said, you know, some of the things that run aground with construction projects are things like insurance and finance. But one of the answers to that is not just scale in terms of producing in a factory, but scale in terms of the finance of it and insurance. What finance companies like to see is what's described in this, which is certainty of demand. And really, to my mind, the only organisation that can truly produce that is the state. Now, they can produce that in partnership with the private sector. They can produce it in partnership with organisations like the Land Development Agency. But we should be looking at councils who are doing things like direct build, possibly working together, multiple councils working together, or really, you know, working with the LDA to ensure that there is that certainty of demand, because once financial institutions and insurance bodies see a certainty of demand, I can tell you they will find a way fairly quickly. They do, because there's profit in that. There's profit in the certainty of demand. And then the second thing would be that standardisation. Again, not something new. I live in a 1930s, basically a 2-up, 2-down terrace house. And when they were building those in Cabra and Inchicore and all of those places, every area became like a little factory in its own right. You had the carpenters on site building multiple units of stairs and then putting them in every single, and they were all the same. So that standardisation, we think of it, we're talking about it right now in terms of the construction, but you could also say the standardisation in terms of the procurement, the standardisation in terms of the contracts. So where councils can standardise their approach and work together, I think that will be the political goal for people like me and other deputies in the room, to look at that standardisation piece, not just in terms of the construction wins, but also in terms of the very long process that you sometimes see in the construction industry to get to the idea of making a building to the final product, where hopefully lots of people will find their, you know, their social housing home for the long run. So I'll pass it off now to the next person.
Hi everyone, I'll send apologies first for Magdalena. She's our co-director of Construct Innovate, but unfortunately she was unwell and unable to attend, so I'm jumping in her place. My name is Daniel McCrum. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Civil Engineering in UCD, where I lead the Modern Methods of Construction Research Group. Within Construct Innovate, I lead one of the 5 theme challenges, so I lead the challenge theme on productivity, affordability and costs. And within that, I've set up a Modern Methods of Construction working group within Construct Innovate, where we have 40 members. Construct Innovate, if you don't know about it, is Ireland's National Research Centre for Construction Technology and Innovation. And we were founded just over a year ago, really. And we had our official launch down in the University of Galway in December 2022, when we could actually take on members. We currently have about in and around 60 member organisations, and the members are industry members and they help drive the research agenda. Okay, so what Construct Innovate does is it links the industry with academia, so the academics who have the expertise in the area that's needed by industry, that's what we focus on, and we link the two up. So within Construct Innovate, well, before I go into that, maybe I'd like to congratulate Rob on the report. My overall feeling when I read it was really, it's probably the first report I've seen where it covers nearly everything, if you know what I mean. But I found it hugely accessible. So I kind of felt the general public could read this and get something from it. And lots of the reports you read on MMC at present they maybe assume a higher level of industry knowledge. So I'd like to congratulate him on that. In terms of NESA, I would kind of agree there are some real issues that the research community can help with around standardisation. So there's projects ongoing at present, there's a funding proposal at present that Construct Innovate have put in to look, in conjunction with the Department of Housing, to look at the standardisation of our construction details in modern methods of construction. So the report alludes to this in terms of the technical guidance documents which kind of help you to build it. So it would be trying to provide something similar to the technical guidance documents for standard construction details. That's different to standard geometries, so the geometric layout, that's another type of standardisation which is badly needed. We're running a webinar series at present It's free, it's from 12 to 1, and I see that Brian Broderick in the back there, who's in Construct Innovate as well. He's a professor in Trinity College Dublin, but he's done a project on the design for manufacture and assembly, but the design for reuse that Nessa has mentioned as well. But within that, what we're hearing is that this standardization, what happens is every single project that they do is a prototype. That was the words used by a light gauge steel manufacturer just on Tuesday this week in the presentation. So it's these one-off houses or one-off developments. So once they get the repeatability, that would be hugely beneficial to partially reduce the cost. Cost is definitely an issue, and there's no doubt about that. There's a sustainability cost that we're going to be paying as well though. So it's not just a purely financial cost, there's a sustainability cost to how we construct. So if we continue to construct in traditional methods, we're not going to meet our sustainability goals in 2030 or a net zero in 2050. It just won't happen. Okay? So there is the financial cost, and everybody in the construction industry tends to think that way, but we're going to have to adapt in that regard. So our research agenda is to try, in Construct Innovate, is to work with industry. And so for myself, I'm working very close with the modern methods of construction organisations, so be they volumetric, modular. But the panelised is by far and away the most popular in Ireland, either the timber or the light gauge steel. So they're definitely areas that we're probably going to focus on first. And in the report it mentions 25 to 48% of residential buildings, depending on who you ask, are constructed using panelised timber construction already. One of the reasons for this is the Irish timber frame manufacturers produce their own code. About 20 years ago, they produced their own design codes, which takes out risk for contractors, structural engineers, architects, etc. So it takes that risk out. So within Construct Innovate, we hope we can try and de-risk this sector. But there's lots of issues that are highlighted. I wouldn't have, in terms of finance or the procurement side of things, it's definitely not my area of expertise. But some of the issues are highlighted are very well known around fire, planning, public sector procurement, pipeline. These continually, when we're engaging with industry, these continue to come up. But skills is also a really big issue. Our workforce is probably, we've roughly 100,000 less than we did in 2005 in the construction sector. So how are we going to build more houses with fewer people? And this is definitely the way to do it, okay? I forget the exact number, but on Tuesday they mentioned, they have far fewer resources are required to build these houses, and that's just skilled labour. So it's part of our future, whether we like it or not. We have to adapt and change towards this. Things around fire, I know there are things in place around the Timber and Construction Research and Development Group and other groups, which is Department of Agriculture, are setting up. So lots of these issues are kind of on the way. What you find in this sector is that developments are happening quite quickly, reports are coming out, and then within a year the report is a bit void, null and void, because things are moving so quickly. So everything is moving quite quickly is what we're seeing. So that's my perspective anyway. So I'll thank you very much, and I'll pass over to Manus for
Thanks, and good morning everyone. So my name is Manus O'Donnell. I'm an economist in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, and I'm responsible for promoting innovation in the construction sector, and a large part of that work focuses on the promotion of modern methods of construction. We work very closely with colleagues in the Department of Housing. Just to say at the outset, again, and to echo the comments of the other panellists, just really welcome the report. I found it, again, like other people have said, really well researched and kind of focused on a lot of the issues that we're focusing on as well. Very accessible, and just to commend the team on producing it, and just kind of reflect that when we started, or when I started in this position 2.5 years ago, there wasn't really all that much available in an Irish context, and I think it just shows the importance and emphasis that people are putting on it, that more and more is coming out, and coming out quite quickly, which is very welcome to have this informed debate. So I wanted to do, again, in the 5 minutes that I have, was maybe just give a sense of what the government is doing in terms of things that we have in place to address some of the issues that have been highlighted in the report and that we've highlighted ourselves. There is a lot going on in this space, but maybe just to say that when the team and when the focus on innovation and construction was established, it was all in the context of the government's plan to address the situation in the housing market, so housing for all, to be able to deliver homes faster, but also in terms of the climate action plan to be able to deliver homes more sustainably. The other thing that I think is worth bearing in mind in this whole conversation is that we need to just consider what happened in the UK in terms of the modular manufacturers. There's been a lot of kind of high profile defaults in the construction sector over there, and I think that that's something that we are very kind of keeping in the fore of our mind. And kind of the thing that we've focused on or put a big emphasis on in the department is being developing a kind of a sustainable strategy, so like walking before we can run and not overextending ourselves, and making sure that we learn the lessons of what happened in the UK. So we produced in the Department of Enterprise with the Department of Housing a modern methods of construction roadmap, which was published in July of last year, and the language there is very specific. A roadmap, it's setting a direction of travel as part of a kind of an iterative process is what we see it. And touching on kind of 6 themes, but maybe just to kind of pull out some of the key points. The first was around demand and pipeline. We've heard obviously why the industry would want a sustainable demand, and again, important that we run before we can walk, and by that I mean that we have the system in terms of government procurers and others ready to respond to kind of an increase in demand. And we've heard the importance around direct build by councils. I think I'd echo that, and that's echoed by the Department of Housing, increasing that. In terms of modern methods of construction and providing a kind of a clear line of sight on pipeline, the Department of Housing have established and announced an accelerated social housing delivery project. So by the end of this year, over 30 sites across the country, 1,800 homes will be delivered via modern methods of construction. The 7 regional frameworks have been established with lead local authorities. So what you have there is local authorities, the procurement agents are engaging in modern methods of construction, and a lot of them wouldn't have had before. So it's building that capacity within the system. The expectation is that the majority of those contracts will be won by 2D systems, because of the fact that that system is a lot more advanced in Ireland in terms of the market, but recognising the role that 3D volumetric systems can play as well, and building on the work of the OPW, who have commissioned 700 volumetric homes to house Ukrainian refugees. The Department of Housing are going to be undertaking a pilot project for 3D volumetric to deliver social homes. And maybe something worth mentioning as well, just it was touched on, is around the use of the design build contract. So that facilitates the early engagement of contractors, which allows modern methods of construction considerations to be taken on much earlier in the process. Something else that we're doing is around training for government procurers, making sure that they're aware of the idiosyncrasies and the nuances in terms of managing an MMC project versus a traditional build project, because, as I mentioned to date, a lot of their experiences, almost all of their experience, will exclusively have been on masonry projects. So making them aware at an early stage of what they need to look out for in an MMC project. And then finally, and I know it's been mentioned a few times, around standardisation, it makes absolute sense. It's something that we've been engaged with the Department of Housing very, very actively on. So the Department of Housing has published a design manual for quality housing. I agree with the sentiments that there is about 60 designs in that, but what the Department of Housing have done in terms of this 1,800 social homes is that they selected a subset of those designs in the design manual. So there's about 5 or 6 that are going to be used with local authorities on a comply or explain basis. So it is kind of addressing some of those issues that were raised, that there used to be loads, now there's fewer. It was unclear whether local authorities had to use these things. They will under this scheme. Then maybe just focus on standards and regulation again, and this is something that we've placed a big emphasis on. We don't want to bake in problems in terms of building compliance into the future with adopting modern methods of construction, and avoid some of the things that we've seen happen to date. So we've been working very closely with the professional bodies to provide training for assigned certifiers, and that was launched by the RIAI. They've done a CPD course in modern methods of construction. That's going to be a series that's ongoing, and there were 70 participants in that training program late last year. The National Building Control Office, which is sits on top of and kind of coordinates and collaborates with all the building control offices, building control authorities and local authorities, launched or ran a CPD course for building control authorities. That was yesterday. That was and typically these CPD courses attract about 100 participants. Yesterday there were over 700 participants in the building control National Building Control Office course, which just shows the level of interest and appetite in modern methods of construction. And then just in this space as well, the National Standards Authority of Ireland is under the remit of the Department of Enterprise, and they administer the Agrimont process, the certification scheme for new and innovative buildings, and we've been working with them to increase, we've kind of substantially increased the number of resources that the team in the Agrimont department have to kind of make sure that there is a steady stream and a quick and efficient Agrimont process for innovative construction products. And what that's translated to is that in the last 12 months there's been a doubling of the number of systems that are Agrimont certified. So this time last year there was about 9, and now there's 17 systems that are Agrimont certified, which really, as kind of has been alluded to, helps with the on-site kind of compliance piece. And then two other things, excuse me, just touch on is the training piece, kind of again alluded to here, but you know, a modern methods construction system it requires different skills. I was in Lucan in Back Weston yesterday, where some of those Ukrainian modular homes built for Ukrainian refugees are being rolled out, and you see that there's a need for precision cranes, the logistics piece, the transport piece, things that may not necessarily be needed on a traditional build. So the kind of the whole of the construction profession will need to be upskilled to a certain extent, and so the expert group on future skills needs is producing a report to set out what skills are needed, and the Department of Further and Higher Education will respond to that. Again, in terms of the education piece, we're working on a demonstration park for modern methods of construction, which is going to be in Mount Lucas. It's going to showcase the most innovative construction products and processes to kind of local authorities, government procurement people, and also to the general public. And then finally, just to talk and maybe touch on something that's very relevant to my department is research and development. So the kind of one of the most powerful relationships you see in economics is the relationship between R&D spend and productivity. And kind of to encourage that and boost that, what we've done in enterprises, you know, with the help of Enterprise Ireland established Construct Innovate, which is kind of really building traction in that space, but also extended the offering that EI can now provide research and innovation grants to domestically focused residential construction companies that wasn't available previously. So I mean, yeah, just to say that there is a lot happening in this space, and yeah, just interested in the conversation afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks, Manus, and thanks to all the panelists for their response. We'll take some questions now. I might just use chair's rights though to get the first one in. One thing that kind of came across to me from the report was it's a kind of another example of this issue of very centralised governance impacting the delivery of housing at the local level. So we already have quite a centralised system of finance where a local authority has to go cap in hand to central government to get funding for housing schemes, which kind of introduces, you know, a lot of inefficiencies. And here we see it manifest in terms of the design of housing. I'm just wondering if, and I suppose I'm targeting this to Rob, Nessa, and probably Manus, but is there any sense in which we're willing to look at, this might be a bit of a dry topic, but a reorganisation of the governance of the way housing is done, so we get away from this highly centralised system. In this case, we've seen it in terms of design codes, towards something more nimble and decentralised, where well-resourced local authorities are actually in a position to deliver some of this stuff themselves. So I'm not sure if anyone wants to take that.
I can come in just really quickly insofar as I think it's really important we forget that the fundamental body of planning in this country is every single local authority, and we very much suffer at the moment because we have the weakest local government in the EU. And therefore, the reason you don't see things like direct build is, as you describe it, that very centralised, mostly since kind of 2015, that very centralised kind of, where often you're going back to the department and, you know, the minister is often making decisions that can kind of change the parameters for the building industry and does often slow things down. I think we really have to look at empowering local authorities. Certainly when I qualified as an architect, there would have been a really robust housing unit in almost every local authority, and by robust I mean there was architects and you know, there was a full team where they could kind of do direct build in a very real way. That's long gone. That's a decade or more gone, and that knowledge, that know-how, and the confidence to be able to say, yeah, we're going to take this proprietary system and roll this out in 120 units in the area. That doesn't exist in local authorities in the same way that it used to, unless you're in a very large local authority. And even then it tends to be contracted out. So I personally think that that's a huge political issue for my side of things.
Yeah, I would completely agree with Ness on that. We have the most centralised government not only in the EU but actually in all of Europe. If you look at the kind of the metrics, and the flip side of that is that we have the least power, or we have the weakest local government out of 39 European countries. It's not just the EU. And I talk about this a little bit in the report, that basically with the direct build delivery of social housing, where you build on public land, there's lots of back and forth between the local authority and the department, and sometimes even the Department of Housing telling local authorities, move this bathroom here, move this bedroom here. It's a very, very centralised process, and this elevates costs significantly. And surely there has to be some other way of doing this. I understand that it was looked at a few years ago when Owen Murphy,
Yep.
it was the Minister for Housing at the time, and apparently the Attorney General said it has to be done this way. I don't know if that's true or not, but
It's not.
it's not true apparently. But maybe just having some sort of an audit system, allow local authorities to build, and then whoever, whether it's the department or someone else, just audits a selection of the developments to make sure that they're cost effective. Another issue then, already alluded to, is the financing, is that local authorities are very dependent on basically capital grants from the department to build social housing. And one of the issues, and this was a particular issue during the global financial crisis years, is that basically local authority building of social housing is essentially tied to the financial well-being of the government of the day. So if there's a recession, that results in lower capital spending, which results in turn in lower building of social housing by local authorities. It's typically not what's done in other countries, where whether it's a local authority or non-profit housing association, they have much more financial autonomy, and for instance they can issue bonds and borrow themselves for the purposes of building social housing, which means that the social housing output is much less tied to the financial well-being or political outlook of the government of the day. So there's a number of governance issues involved there.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, I guess. What I would say is that you kind of, given the scale of the housing crisis, that you need to kind of be pulling on both levers. So, in terms of direct build, that's certainly something that in the modern methods construction space, the government is very focused on in terms of those 1,800 social homes, encouraging approved housing bodies who are another crucial kind of stream in terms of delivery of social homes, empowering them to engage more in direct build, but also pulling on the lever in terms of building bigger bundles of projects with more standardized designs, grouping together local authority projects through the National Development Finance Agency process, because at that kind of the scale is needed in terms of being able to attract larger players into the market, making it worth their while, and gaining those repetitive benefits of modern methods of construction, and also the work of the Land Development Agency. So I think that we're in a point that it's not an either-or situation, but that we need to kind of be pulling on all available levers.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm always struck by how, a photo of the minister opening a six home scheme in some local area is expected to reflect well on our current governance arrangement for housing, whereas really it should be, some empowered local authority doing it. But thank you for those responses. I wasn't sure whether I had a good question there, but you all gave good answers, so much appreciated. We'll open it up to questions from the audience now, so if anyone would like to ask a question, just raise your hand, and if you could say who you are and where you work or who you're affiliated to. Yeah, gentleman at the back there.
Thank you very much, David Rouse, housing from the Housing Agency. Thanks very much, David Rouse with the Housing Agency. Thank you very much to Robert for your presentation. The first day of spring is always a good day for good ideas coming through. I'm not a construction technical person, so my question might come across as slightly naive. Perhaps you might comment on the extent to which MMC has relevance or otherwise in the retrofit space. Maybe it's the case that particular structures are unique and therefore MMC doesn't have application, but interested to know whether you've any thoughts on that particular space. Thank you.
I'm not a
Oh.
Yeah, you should answer that one, if you can.
Well, actually, there's a really good example down in the NEIC in the northeast inner city of kind of old social housing. Often it's the facade that needs to be retrofitted. So most complex facades now are actually proprietary. You effectively buy them off the shelf from a company, often not in Ireland, in Germany or Austria or somewhere like that. And often you'd be looking at things like window cassettes that also have ventilation included in the cassettes. Items like that are really important in terms of refurb, so I would consider it really, really relevant. And often you're choosing refurb not just because of the carbon impact, but also for the timeline, and there's a big win in MMC.
I mean, the point I would like to make is that you mentioned about design for deconstruction and reuse. If we had done this in the past, this would be a no-brainer. Like you click it off, click it back on. I mean, that makes it sound a bit trivial, but I would say from a research perspective, the community has started to talk about this, but the point of standardization is the issue, and every project being different is an issue as well, so yeah.
But just to say on that, like a lot of our original social homes are already standardized, so like I'm totally biased because it's my constituency, but there's a ton of kind of Herbert Sims era buildings that are now at the end of their life in terms, like they're just leaky and but volumetrically they're fantastic. Like you're never going to get a social home nowadays built to the generous proportions. So we want to hold on to them. We want the timeline, and there's multiples of those buildings. So if we could find a good refurb option, we could roll it out. There's tens of those buildings. So there is an option for scale on many of them.
I suppose one final thing about retrofit is it's hugely important from an embodied carbon. We don't want to build something again and new if we don't have to, and that should be the initial mindset if possible. So anything technically that can improve this would be, very welcomed. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a technical construction person either. Just a couple of comments. MMC for social housing purposes won't always be appropriate because some types of social housing developments are, small infill developments, and I guess you can kind of call that it's not quite retrofit, but it's related. And just another point that is worth making, when we're talking about standardization, we're not talking about, every social housing unit is going to look the same, it's Soviet Union in the 1980s or something like that. But you can have, and I hope I'm not speaking nonsense here, but the technical people can correct me, but you can have a basic structure which is standardized using MMC, and then you can sort of have your own imprint in terms of the outer shell or the cladding of that unit. So it doesn't mean that we're going to be living in this dystopian world of, everywhere looks the same and it's awful. But
Well, Cabra and Inchicore are not dystopian, and they're all
Thanks for the panel. My name is Kevin from the Fiscal Council. I was looking at construction wages, and one of the points in this, as well as MMC, is that you could get to a greater number of construction workers, which seems to be necessary by increasing construction wages. So where's that perspective maybe in the solution to the housing crisis, in your opinion, as well as greater productivity, which you're getting at here with this report?
yeah, it's a bit more my area, being economist. Yeah, I talk about it a little bit in the report. One of the driving forces to greater use of, say, precast concrete in the 2000s was that you had, now, not that we want to replicate the 2000s when we had a housing bubble, but because there was such demand for housing at the time, bricklayers and the wet trades, their wages were increasing a lot. And this was an incentive on the part of, say, contractors or developers to use precast concrete. Not that we want to move towards precast concrete, but to illustrate the point that the more wages rise for, say, bricklayers and, say, workers who are involved in traditional construction in cement and things like that, the greater the incentive there will be to automate it using MMC and other types of methods. So yes, absolutely in favor of that. That could be, the answer there could be to, because there's already a certain amount of setting of wages in the construction sector. You've got union rates, and so certainly part of the solution could be collectively bargained, say, wages that are higher for bricklayers and things like that, as a good in its own right, but also as an incentive potentially for automation as well.
Yeah, the interaction between like the labour market and modern methods of construction is a really interesting question, and maybe I'm not going to answer it directly in terms of the wage piece, but just to point out that in the UK, when they came to modern methods of construction, it was through the Mark Farmer report, which was published I think around 2015, and the main focus of that was around the observation that a lot of the people working in construction in terms of those very labour intensive jobs, in terms of bricklaying and things like that, were all coming to retirement. So they were looking at a situation where a retirement cliff, where there'd be an absolute shortage of some of the key professions in the construction sector, and modern methods of construction was seen as a way to alleviate that and to kind of get ahead of what would be a very large increase in the cost of construction. And in an Irish context, something that I think all construction businesses are facing is this viability challenge, where building a house costs X and you're only able to sell it for Y, and increasing wages at kind of like those rates where we could go to without adoption of modern methods of construction would only make that viability challenge more difficult.
Just one point from a higher education perspective. The students who decide to come and do, for example, engineering, for example, they look 10 years in the future to see what wages they will be earning and decide that's part of their decision whether to do it. So if you could increase those wages, I mean, it would be hugely beneficial. We would have more graduates coming through and we would have more people in the system, just from a purely higher educational perspective.
Yeah, gentleman there in the back.
Yeah, hello, Brian Broderick, Trinity College Dublin, and a researcher in Construct Innovate with Dan. So just to pick up on that point, you know, I think it's clear that modern methods of construction can improve the quality of buildings, they can improve the speed of delivery of housing, they can be more sustainable from a climate and a circularity point of view. But there is very little evidence that modern methods of construction can actually reduce the cost of housing. So does the panel think that there are ways in which that can be made to happen? And that leads into the discussion you just had on the last point, but maybe in more general terms beyond even wages.
I'm a bit wary of the idea of that this will impact construction costs. I think it might impact construction times, which might in itself constrain the costs. You're just not on site as long. But my feeling is that, you know, this industry is a global industry, and the impacts on you know, availability of raw materials and the kind of costs required for that kind of dynamic nature of like factory buildings. So, you know, somebody wants a bathroom pod, but next year they want something different. I'm not sure that that's the best way to sell this in terms of construction, because it is a global industry and we are looking at shortages in terms of those raw materials, things as basic as sand. So I would be a bit wary, but I'm not the economist in this answer.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's not like, I mean, there is this idea that at a certain scale and a certain standardization you can operate a factory and keep it going, and you can see you may see massive cost reductions, but it's certainly not what we are building on. It's more about the a focus on ensuring quality home can be delivered much more quickly, which will have an impact on borrowing costs, but it's not going to bring down costs very much from where they are now. The thing maybe worth bearing in mind in the cost conversation is that modern methods of construction are likely to be a more sustainable solution. So as the price of carbon goes up, you might see that that while costs don't come down for modern methods of construction, you might see traditional construction costs going up.
I think from a research and development perspective, we've done a report on which will be coming out soon around standards, the testing and certification, and what we found is that it's quite hard to get the certification. It costs a lot of money. So once you have so the codes don't exist for designers, so you have to do the agreement route, which is expensive, but there's real value in it. It makes you a market leader then once you have that. But one of the issues is then if we could start importing these panelized homes and volumetric homes, and now we have competition, okay? So I think some of the issues then around, but the problem with importing these around certification and testing is they have to meet our building regulations, which are different to other jurisdictions' building regulations. So clarity about how we could do that. So there's European routes of certification that may or may not be valid, and it takes you time and money to figure out whether they're valid or not. So if we could start importing, I think we've then got real competition, you know, and then that might drive down price, you know. We have a small market, like don't forget, we're 5.5 million people, we're not that big a market, you know.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly, just to say, I think that framing in terms of cost point initially is really important, because if this is framed in terms of something that's going to result in cheaper houses, shall we say, which I think we can agree that in the short term it isn't, there's a danger that the public and politicians lose appetite for it. So just this week the House of Lords, I think it's called the Construction Committee in England, released a report, and it's basically saying because this has been framed in terms of something that's going to result in cheaper housing, and we can't see the evidence for that, it's gone back to the industry and said, well, show us why we should do this. So it's already introducing this kind of sceptical tone towards us. I think we would do well in Ireland to not lead with the cost point, and I think Robbie's done pretty well in the report in doing that.
Yeah, just to reiterate it, there's other benefits aside from cost. I mean, there could be an indirect cost effect, because if it's quicker to do MMC and if we can get it up off the ground, well then the supply of housing can increase, and then that will have a knock-on effect in costs, and even some of the materials such as land, because there's a pretty good relationship between house prices and land prices, but it's not necessarily going to result in massive cost reductions, even though standardization and a stable pipeline can reduce costs for manufacturers. I don't know how much it can reduce. There were some quotes there, but at the moment it's more expensive, especially modular units. But maybe if we get up and running, maybe a manufacturer could tell us. Maybe it's then competitive. I mean, some aspects are already competitive with conventional construction, such as timber frame buildings.
Just to pick up on that point about value rather than cost, I suppose. So, if you can produce a home with, 50% less embodied carbon compared to a traditional version, and that's part of the procurement process, it's not just cost, but is the sustainability of it. How far does it have to travel? It has to, if we have to import it, well, there's embodied carbon associated with importing it. So maybe if we produce it locally, it might be a bit more expensive, but actually, overall, you're reducing the embodied carbon. So I think that has been mentioned, when we're having discussions, with MMC people in general, and it could be, if part of the procurement was seen to be value rather than just cost. So the value of producing it off-site, so you have fewer workers on site, less dust, less environmental impact on site. So if these things start to become part of the procurement process, I think it can make a difference.
Hi, Archie O'Donnell from Cosmos, Cost Consultancy. Just I suppose a comment. My colleague here, Jared from Catalyst, we worked on a lot of projects on the compliance side, and compliance is a real burden. So just to take it back, I think it's difficult to put all the different technologies under the one label as MMC, because you have your kind of almost stick-built century timber frame, the IS 440 frames, and yet in timber frame as well you have your kind of closed panel timber frame, so a very much more sophisticated offering, and bio-based timber offerings. The big difficulty that we had, the big difficulty we had though was Part D, and when we look at modular in pharmaceutical or in tech, you've got a certified product, you've got a standardized product. So there's any number of about 7 manufacturing plants in Ireland that can provide modular skids and plant rooms. But when you take that to housing, there's a number of large-scale firms that are trying to get into the Irish market in Denmark, in Poland, in the UK, in China. But they can't. They don't understand our prescriptive regulations around fire and around fitness for purpose. And without that, and they're not going to go to the extent, they can take the risk of doing a design for a project, then a year later that goes for fire cert, and the fire engineer says, we can't certify this because it hasn't got Agrimont. And Agrimont takes 2 years, it's a very long process, and it's not a compliance standard. I think people use Agrimont as compliance, but it's not compliance. It's just one of a set. It shows that it's capable of compliance, so it's a flag of convenience. But I think the big barrier is that we need to get standardized typologies and get them fully tested. So there's a lab up in Jordanstown, I don't know why we're not using that, building standardized typologies, writing a standard based on that, and then any manufacturer can design to that standard. So in Denmark you have everything they do for like stair cores is standardized. So you just pick off-the-shelf components you don't design anything bespoke. It's all modular. Modular refers to the sizing rather than anything else, and then the materials are fully tested. And I think that has to be the approach. The industry needs to move together, put together a fund to actually get type testing done, and then use that to deliver, because the companies that can deliver at scale, even they're just finding that this is a big barrier, and it's the risk that you have to design these kind of buildings at concept stage. You have to lock in modular at concept stage, or it doesn't work, and that's just the biggest challenge that we found. Don't know, would you concur, Jer?
Very much.
Yeah.
So I mentioned at the start that Construct Innovate actually submitted a funding proposal to do exactly what you're mentioning. So it's standardised construction details and build-ups to try and produce maybe supplementary guidance to technical guidance documents. So this would be open source and freely available for anyone to use. It could speed up the agreement process, or it could be used standalone. This will take several years to do, but we will be, as part of that, we included the testing. So we will pay for the testing, do the testing, and disseminate that testing open source so everyone can see it. So we want to work with industry to understand what these details should be, what the build-up should be, party walls, that sort of thing, what the connections should look like. So we are working with industry on that, and the Department of Housing on that. So we've submitted a proposal, so and that's for one or more types of MMC. So we haven't heard back yet whether it's successful or not, but I definitely agree with the sentiment. The other thing that you mentioned is there are things like in the UK, for example, so we can't rely on the UK for certification anymore because they're non-EU body, but there are things like the National Home Building Council. They have NHBC accepts, and this is a warranty thing provided by them. If you follow their details for MMC, they'll give you a warranty for your building and insure your building. So maybe something like that could be replicated here in Ireland.
And maybe just to pick up on something else that I kind of maybe interpreted in your question around kind of standardised parts, like the stair piece and like window sizes and frames and things like that. And I kind of, every time this comes up, everyone mentions Henry Fords. You can have whatever colour you want as long as it's black, and that's what I understand happens in Denmark, that you get one choice of door. You don't get as many doors as you want. You use the door that's there. And the Department of Housing is doing a piece of research on that to kind of define. In the UK, they have a kit of parts, which is meant to be, your Lego blocks that you use to build a house. So the windows are all the same size, the doors are all the same size, and that's something that we're striving to get to as well.
The gentleman at the back who's been waiting, very back. Sorry, we're down to one mic.
So yeah, thanks very much. It's Killian Morris. I'm a development consultant at Whitebeam Consulting. The presentations were very good, and it's great to see the focus on MMC. One piece I think wasn't covered. Obviously, the focus is on a lot on state delivery of housing, but I think it's important to acknowledge, particularly on the cost point, is that MMC is something that's also very, very attractive to the private sector. And in particular where you're talking about banks, large organisations, pension funds, it's not just about cost. These organisations recognise the benefits of ESG. They see the way that MMC has a huge role in that, particularly in things like a point that was covered in terms of attracting more people into the industry, which we badly need, attracting more women into the industry, making the industry safer. But as well as reducing waste and the cutting carbon. So all of these things are hugely important, or certainly increasingly important to private capital as well. So I think MMC and the ESG benefits in particular is a huge driver, because these types of private capital will accept a lower return for something that has a positive impact. So that's one important point to note. And I think also working in tandem with government-led initiatives. But the question I have to ask is just, it's great to hear that the government is taking initiatives and there's pilot studies underway, but how much weight has been given to studies of international best practice, and not only best practice, but lessons learned? So there's really good things happening, as Archie knows, in Scandinavia they build a lot of MMC. They have to, because they have to build quickly in a harsh winter climate. It's interesting to see in the States and Australia building codes being relaxed, so you can now build tall commercial buildings in timber. But unfortunately in the UK, there's been some high-profile failures, and Mark Farmer, who was referenced, must be wringing his hands. So just wondering what we're doing in terms of looking at best practice abroad.
Do you want to take a couple just
Yeah.
with one mic? I think there was a guy there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Kevin Ryan from the National Standards Authority. Manus mentioned our team earlier on with in respect of MMC. And just firstly, in terms of Archie's point, he mentioned agreement, NSAI agreement, and we are aware it does take a long time. What we've seen recently in terms of analysis is that company readiness is a big factor. And I'd be interested to hear from Rob, did it come across in the data gathering? Did he get any sense of the company's awareness in terms of the range of tests that they need to have before they approach certification? And then the second part of that is related in terms of the readiness. Had they done any gap analysis in terms of their factory quality versus their site finishing quality? Because what we're very focused on in the NSAI MMC team is that we can inspect the factories, which it's important to say are at an extremely high quality. I personally have been very impressed with what Ireland has in terms of infrastructure for manufacturing. But it is very difficult to see that finishing on site. NASA alluded to that as well. Those final steps, there is a gap there. So I'd be interested to hear, did that gap come true in terms of the data gathering? Thank you.
Any more questions before we end?
Thank you, Doyle Downey, National Economic and Social Council. Congratulations on the work. It's excellent. Just one question relating back to the mortgage market and the insurance market and some of the impediments that you've identified there for the rollout of MMC housing in particular, and then whether there are any transferable lessons immediately from the commercial sector that is using MMC, was alluded to just there in pharma and tech. Thank you.
Hi, Fiona McGonigal from the National Disability Authority. I just have a quick question. It was, how do you see MMC benefiting design for older and disabled communities?
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. Okay, so we've got 4 questions there. I'll leave it open to the panel who wants to jump in where.
I can. Or sorry, do you want to? It's his choice. It's his choice.
Company readiness and awareness of the range of tests that they have to have. That wasn't a complaint that came across. Some of the complaints were that the extent of testing that they would have to undertake. So for instance, they might have tested a wall and it was deemed compliant or safe, and then they would have to do additional testing just because they've added a few sockets or something like that. So it was that they had to test again and again, even when, according to them, there wasn't large differences between things that they had already tested. That was one complaint. And sometimes another complaint was that these materials and processes were covered by some of the EU standards, whether it was the harmonised or unharmonised standards, but yet they had to be tested in Ireland again. That was another complaint. And in terms of quality, factory quality versus site quality, the only thing that came up was that sometimes sites weren't serviced with, say, water or ESB, and that was an impediment to MMC, because if the site isn't ready to take the unit, the module can get damaged or the panel can get damaged in the meantime. So that was definitely an impediment. And then very quickly on Dahi, lessons from farmers and so on. I'm not sure, but the only thing that came across, well, there was a couple of things, and you'll read in the report. Basically, banks, and I mentioned in my presentation, are unwilling to provide mortgages for modular homes. if you look at the actual development process, the funding of the development phase as opposed to the mortgages, there was a bit of diversity of views, but at least the interviewee who I trusted most, or one of them, he was of the view that the funds tend to be a little bit less risk averse than the banks. So the various funds, whether it's private equity or whoever, that are involved in the actual development process, they're more willing to fund MMC than banks. So.
Just to pick up on that question around international best practice, you know, I really kind of recognised that no country in the world has kind of like cracked this fully and properly. We're all kind of scratching around and trying to kind of put in place the best policy framework to encourage modern methods of construction, and you know, so making sure that we create and establish links internationally is something that we put a lot of emphasis on. So we're part of the Department of Enterprise, part of a kind of a research group with the United States. Their Housing and Urban Development Department is doing a lot of work in this space. The UK, Japan, and Sweden would be seen as countries that are depending on your view, slightly or a lot ahead in terms of modern methods of construction. We've spoken to the European Commission, and you know, I think that in terms of where we're going to continue our focus in terms of learning from international best practices, it's in that first space. Is there anything else I wanted to... No, I think that was it. Thanks.
So yeah, a couple of, I suppose, on the, Kev, on your point there from NSAI around, you know, I think knowledge sharing is a huge thing here, which the industry doesn't do, but they recognise they don't do it. It's a funny thing to recognise you don't do something and then don't do it, you know. But what they say is that if you had companies sharing their expertise and experience of the agreement process openly with each other, I think that would really help. So just as an example, I think things like that would really, really help. In relation to the standardisation, you know, that you mentioned about international best practice, we did look at the UK when we were looking at the system of standards testing and certification, you know, and we did look at the European, so the ETA approaches and things like that. But the big thing it all comes back down to then when it's about testing certification is that you have to be compliant with the Irish building regulations. That's what it comes down to. So there's no magic fix for that. The USA, I've seen a document recently where they have the exact same issues around standard or testing and certification. You know, they don't have the facilities, and you know, so there is, you know, is there third-party certification is required? You know, an independent third-party certifier to required in Ireland. I don't know if we have the throughput for that or not. Maybe we do. Maybe we don't. And finally, on the point about older and disabled, I think that falls under the building regulations. So these modern methods of construction would be building regulation compliant, so things around access and egress and things like that. But it's an interesting point that I actually haven't heard before, so thanks for raising that point, yeah.
I would like to come in on that disability issue. So I think this could be a really positive part of this, because to my mind the building regs are completely unusable at the moment. Part L is not fully accessible. It's if you want to visit a home. We know that a significant part of the population, well more than 10%, will require some kind of accessible supports, and we know that most people will live 8 or 9 years of their lives with some form of disability. So we're not only talking about kind of wheelchair accessible thing, we're talking about, you know, buildings for people with visual impairment, people who are older, generational living, and so I think actually standardisation that includes a kind of a 10% of that consideration of, you know, the larger doors, and particularly actually around things like bathrooms. I have a kid who needs an accessible bathroom, and I think there could be a big win there, that there would be a certain percentage in the procurement, in the contract phase of things, whereby a certain percentage of social homes would be universally designed. And we are lucky that we were one of the few countries who have a centre for universal design, and like that's a huge resource that I sometimes think that we don't draw on. I know Minister Anne Rabbitte definitely is well aware of it, but certainly I think Part L isn't fit for purpose in terms of the disabled community, and what we really need are a percentage, a standard percentage of new homes that are built to universal design standards, not to Part L. Part L is not good enough. So I'd be very critical of that. I also wanted to come back to that thing, I can't remember if it was yourself who said around relaxing the fire regs, and I'm going to be very political and say we wouldn't want to relax the fire regs, but we need to evolve them. Because I think we do live, and I know everybody probably in the construction sector has been following in the last few years that post-Grenfell reality of the where we fell down between kind of laboratory testing and what it means to purchase proprietary facades, and what the translation between the two would be. So I think we have to be really careful in our language that Ireland does have a slightly misaligned for legacy issues, and partly because we don't have a hugely industrialised construction industry to my mind. We do have a slightly misaligned with the rest of the EU fire regulation requirements, and we need to evolve them, not necessarily relax them. And then finally, it does strike me that some of the discussions around mortgage products, it reminds me of some of the discussions we had during COVID around cooperative building. So there's a fantastic group in Ireland who are looking at, if there are multiple people who basically want to build a one-off house, you can come together and build a street. So let's say in Sweden, like I lived in a cooperative building for a year in Sweden, where you don't actually own your apartment, you own a share in a building and you all created it together. You cannot get that over the line in Ireland because the mortgage product is just not there, because we only have one fully pillar bank, and we don't have a public bank like the Sparkasse in Germany. Now there has been changes to credit unions which will allow different credit unions to band together to provide those mortgage products, and there might be some scope there, but I definitely think that there is a problem in Ireland in the mortgage industry for lots of reasons we won't go into here, whereby those more innovative products like kind of co-housing or cooperative buildings and like MMC, it's the lack of competition in the banking sector which does have a negative impact and is not easily solved unless we become much more competitive. And we are a small country with a small cohort of people, and it's very hard to attract larger banks into the industry and into the sector, and that's a reality we're going to have to deal with.
I just want to jump in with a question quickly. Given that it's pretty clear the technology is racing ahead of regulation here, did you find, I'm just wondering, Dan or Manus, in your kind of best practice research, in Sweden, the US, wherever maybe, is there more of a dialogue between regulators and industry in terms of the governance of this whole thing? Is that something that we could possibly work on?
So, and just maybe a brief answer, but in Sweden, they build, I think it's cross-laminated timber hotels that go up to like 22. Airports as well. Well, I'd be more concerned about the hotels, to be honest, because people are sleeping in them. People can sleep in airports too, I suppose. But yeah, 22-story hotels out of like cross-laminated timber, so the structure of the building is made out of wood. And the sense from our conversations with them was that there was just a much greater trust there in kind of what the designs and what the numbers will say, rather than a kind of a conversation between regulators and people. But that is a kind of a dialogue through the Timber and Construction Working Group in terms of bringing the Department of Housing, building control authorities and the industry together to kind of have that dialogue and come to a solution on what the building regulations in this space likely do need a change, but what goes in their place. So you can't just take out something without kind of a plan.
Just to follow up on that, evidence is needed, I mean, that's the whole point, is that evidence is needed to demonstrate that this meets our building regulations. So they are flying ahead, but I would say they're also restricted, and so, particularly when you go to multi-story for volumetric modular and light gauge steel panelized construction, they don't have the design codes to rely on. So they have to figure it out themselves, and they have to go through the agreement process, and then they want to protect that because they don't want to share that information because it took them a long time and money to do that. So I would say, I know from working with a company who do volumetric modular, 50-story buildings in the UK, and they go through third-party approval rather than an agreement process, you know. But they find that they have to educate the people who are approving their systems, because their systems are so different. They're very different to traditional construction. So there is an educational piece there as well, for sure, that you've kind of touched on. So, but the evidence has to be there. You know, if we don't have the evidence and it doesn't meet our building regulations, we should be conservative. You know, that's the kind of approach. You know.
Okay, we've been given a 5-minute warning, which is probably more like 3 minutes now. So, gentlemen here, maybe we'll have the final question. Thanks.
I didn't intend to be the final question. My name is Francis De Rosa. I'm a member of the board of TASC, but I'm only speaking for myself. I want to congratulate Rob on the report and everybody else who was involved, and indeed the panel this morning. I would really like to see this debate happening in the Dáil, have all of these issues thrashed out and a decision being made that some minister is going to take it by the neck and drag it all together, because I think that's the only way it can be driven the way it needs to be driven. I'm all for devolving power to local authorities in the housing area. I think the greater provision of social housing by local authorities would calm the markets. We discussed cost, but the price of a house is not driven solely by cost, it's driven by the market. And so, you know, a direct provision, in my view, and not an economist, I think would have a calming effect on land prices and indeed on housing prices. But I would like to see some kind of centralised getting grips with the issues that were raised here, because while it's not the total answer to the housing crisis, certainly it is part and parcel of how we need to move forward. Final point to make is, one of the points made early on was the question of demand, and that, you know, builders and developers and so on will respond to demand. I think there's no question but we have demand. The demand for housing is there. It's a question of how we actually organise the provision of feeding that demand, and I think the role of government is extremely important in that. I think the multiplicity of schemes that are there, I'm not criticising them, but I think there needs to be a greater concept, a greater concern, if you like, about not just what we're going to do this year and next year, but our population is predicted to grow for the next 75 years. You know, so, you know, the demand is there and will be there. The question of how do we organise the meeting of that demand, and that is a matter for central government.
Thank you very much, Francis. Would anyone like to comment on that? I think, just to say, I think there's plenty of fodder in the report for oral questions in the Dáil, just to say that, but would anyone like to, any of the panelists like to comment on that?
I can get in your PQ now.
Please spare me the PQs. I'll be the one answering them. Just to pick up on the point around the centralised policy process, that was something that we in the Department of Enterprise recognised at the very beginning of this process, that the policy response, you're essentially going to move at the pace of the slowest actor. So we recognised that there was a piece around procurement, a piece around research and development, a piece around skills, a climate action piece. So we established the Modern Methods of Construction Leadership and Integration Group, which the department chairs, which is brings in industry as well in terms of the policy making process. So I feel like that's been a really effective centralising force to bring people together. And you know, in terms of taking on some of the things in this report, certainly it's a space where I would intend on having a kind of a discussion. So I feel like we do have some of the mechanisms in place already.
Okay, no one's reaching out for the mic, so I think, given that we've had our time warning, we might leave it at that. I just want to thank our panel, Manas, Dan and Nessa, and a big thank you to Rob, the lead author, and a congratulations to him on his swan song report with TASC. And thank you very much for a very lively discussion, and yeah, please do take the messaging in the report forward and continue the conversation. Thank you all very much, and good afternoon.
Absolutely.